Let them kill us all and we'll stand and watch. Well, brother, that ain't for me. I'll be running and a jumping and a skipping and a bopping when they blow me to smithereens.
I'm now porn adjacent. I run a tabletop game stream regularly with some porn stars, which you can check out with suitable precautions in place at tabletopless.org. And just know that I put as much effort into this campaign as I would any other tits or no tits. Hello lovelies, I thought we might have a chat today. I haven't been doing my live stream news stuff because it just wasn't getting the traction, but occasionally you just want a break from doing something more produced. The Amazing Atheist has recently been doing a whole bunch of videos setting out where he stands on a lot of the issues of the day and the perennial issues, because he keeps being accused of having changed somehow. And I think I can empathise to a degree with that sort of feeling, so I thought I might do something similar, but instead of stringing it out over several videos, I'll just do it as one big one, which hardly anyone will watch, obviously, but it's a good exercise for myself, if nothing else. And some of you find my voice soothing, apparently, so you keep saying. So, let's talk about this stuff. Some of it's topical, some of it's perennial. There's something a friend of mine said to me once, which sticks with me. He said, even when I disagree with you about something, I know you've always thought it through, and that the position that you've come to is because you've examined it all kinds of different ways and you've spent a lot of time thinking about it. So hopefully that carries over to a lot of you as well. When I started this channel, and a bit before I started this channel, new atheism was a big thing, and a lot of activity on YouTube, at least the corners of YouTube that I frequented, was about skepticism and atheism and debunking and so on. At this point it kind of feels like everything has been said that needs to be said about these topics, though I appreciate that a new crop of people have come up and are now addressing these things. Now, my position hasn't really changed on any of this. Religion is absurd, ridiculous, dangerous, utterly irrational, has nothing to support it. And what people call sophisticated arguments for religion are not. They are just wordy, pseudo-intellectual restatements of exactly the same absurd nonsense that you come to expect. Like the Kalam cosmological argument is just, but where did it all come from, in a way that is designed to be confusing and to try and throw you. Then there's presuppositionist apologetics, which is just relies on its sheer ridiculousness to kind of fox you when you try to argue against it. It's not necessarily just religion though, but it's blind belief in anything, and that includes ideology. And the reason that the atheist YouTubers, the atheist position is so much weaker these days is because people who had faith in ideology rather than religion had become incredibly active within the atheist community, as we've seen happen in other nerd communities. So to me, I think the problem is not religion per se, though it is one of the most obvious, obnoxious and dangerous forms of this, but it's faith, it's belief without evidence. It is sticking to bad ideas being seen as a virtue, regardless what those ideas are. So if you're a devout Christian, that's a problem, because pragmatism and reality will not intrude upon that. If you're a devout Marxist or a devout libertarian or anarcho-capitalist, it's the same problem every time. And I try not to do that. Don't always succeed, but I'm at least trying. I try not to have faith in anything, but only to believe things on a provisional basis based upon the evidence that there is for them, and that seems to me to be the way to navigate through that. It's a tough time to be alive. It's a tough time to think that your children, your descendants, or your extended family or people in the future really have much of anything to look forward to. This is the first generation, I believe, that is likely to be worse off than their parents. Even the material stuff that capitalism is supposed to offer us simply isn't available to a lot of people anymore. You can't really aspire to having a home, to being able to afford to have a family. A good education no longer means that you're going to get a good job. Demography is shifting in a way that means that the majority of the population is going to be dependent on the minority. Environmental catastrophe. We can look at what's happened with COVID and how people, even in the midst of a crisis, will actively refuse to do the right thing, will rebel against doing the right thing, no matter the science and so on. Our trust in all of the things that we need to have trust in has been demolished, and largely by those institutions themselves. The academy has been crippled by bad research, by activist research, by corrupt research, so that the good data loses credibility along with all the bad, whether it be activist scholarship on gender issues or race issues or whatever else, or whether it be oil companies buying results from people. So we can't even recognize the problems that we're having even in the midst of them, and that doesn't give me a great deal of hope for the future. It leaves one feeling incredibly trapped and exasperated, and causes people to dehumanize themselves in your eyes, because they are so detached from reality that they place everyone at risk. And I don't really see how we navigate beyond that. In the absence of leadership, because populism tends to be the opposite of leadership, and in the absence of solid, hard facts, well, not the absence, but it being so hard to discern what is fact from what is bullshit, what's left is individual action, and that's not enough. But it can at least salve your conscience. I, for example, have over the past few years piecemeal paid for a whole bunch of trees to be planted, enough that it will offset the carbon production that I produce in my entire lifetime and some beyond, and much of that in the form of fruit trees, which are set to be planted in impoverished areas to supplement food and provide some local economy to those areas in second and third world countries. So things like that I think you can do yourself, but it's not enough. But if we all do it, then maybe we can start to make a difference. But it feels like false hope. But all the structures and institutions that we have feel completely immobile, unable to adapt, unable to shift, unable to move. There's just too much inertia in politics and the academy and in society as a whole, and no way clear to educate, and I mean educate, not re-educate or propagandize, or to convince people. So I don't hold out a great deal of hope. I had thought that when you're in the midst of a crisis, at least then people will be forced to recognize it and to act accordingly. But everything around COVID has disavowed me of that rather positive now it seems, and hopeful way of looking at reality. Our politics are no longer fit for purpose. Our political institutions, the way in which we do things, technology and society, memetics, move incredibly rapidly now, much more rapidly than they used to, and yet we're still using 17th century, 18th century at best, 19th century political institutions to try and make rules and to keep up with that constantly shifting and moving reality. Nationalism is resurgent at a point in human history where it makes no sense whatsoever, where the unstoppable arrow of time would seem to indicate that we come together in larger blocks, cooperate in larger numbers in order to address the problems that we see in the world, such as climate change, for example. And it requires that level of cooperation that doesn't normally exist outside of wholesale widespread wartime. There's a reason after World War I and World War II that planned economies and so on were so popular, even within ostensibly capitalist liberal systems. It's because they worked so well during the war, while everyone was willing to make the sacrifice, that it was thought that they would work well in peacetime. Turned out not so much, but the idea of mass corporation or massive investment to deal with problems does work. The Manhattan Project was a massive investment of time and expertise and money to solve a particular problem. Unfortunately, a very destructive one. But over this last year, we've seen the whole world come together and spend an enormous amount of money in order to rapidly develop a vaccine, which we'll be rolling out this month. We did manage to cooperate, at least for a while, on a global basis to cut down on CFCs, and as a result, the ozone layer began to repair itself. China's kind of bucked that trend now, but it is possible, but the institutions that we have are not agile or responsive enough. In the UK and the US, I think we've seen that there is a massive democratic deficit and a lack of leadership. Technocracy shouldn't be a dirty word, because leadership by experts would rather seem to suggest that we should go along with the people who know the most about whatever problem it is that we're facing. Elite, similarly, shouldn't be a dirty word, except it's not referring to elites, it's referring to people who are particularly powerful. The stratospheric 1%, the people that own all the money which does all the work in our systems. But the UK electoral system is manifestly undemocratic. The US system is manifestly undemocratic. Both of them need changing and modernising, but there is no will to do so. And even when, against the odds, propositions have come forward to modernise and change our electoral systems, people reject it because the system happens to favour their team at that time rather than humanity as a whole. And you have to ask yourself, what is the purpose of government? What is the purpose of democracy? And do our systems deliver that? Either of those things? And I would say no. Our governments are neither effective nor representative. So these are big problems, but I don't see any way of fixing them. So as I said earlier, even at breaking point, where the crisis is manifest and current, obvious and catastrophic, people are unwilling to do the necessary to change things. I mean, the US just had a brush with at least near totalitarianism, and they were incredibly lucky that Trump was so utterly incompetent. Not a fascist, but still a danger to the institutions which barely held out, that need reinforcing, that need changing. But is there any will to do so? And similarly here in the UK, on top of COVID, we're still pressing ahead with an utterly ruinous Brexit that the majority, the overwhelming majority of the population is now against, at least in its current form, compounding the problem. What are you supposed to do? How can you change it? The only thing we seem to be able to really do is to change ourselves and maybe set up our own alternative societies alongside the mainstream society, where everyone voluntarily buys in somehow. Cooperatives, I don't know, communes might make a comeback. I mean, they kind of already are with house shares and so on. I don't know what the solutions are, but I can point to the problems. I am incredibly frustrated with people's political illiteracy, and this is particularly true when it comes to left-wing politics. Barely a day goes by when someone doesn't confuse fascism for being a left-wing form of politics. It's the opposite. Literally nothing that the Nazis did or believed conforms with left-wing political thought. But this confusion is worsened because a lot of people who say that they are left-wing act in a way that is contradictory to left-wing politics, behave in a way that is contradictory to left-wing politics. This is particularly true of, I don't know what you'd even call it, the pseudo-left, the new left, the identitarian left that isn't really even left-wing, because they propose hierarchies, they propose treating people differently according to their scale in terms of their identity, whether it be race or gender, disability, or whatever else. All they're doing is inverting the old hierarchy that we had done so much towards getting rid of. It's antithetical to left-wing beliefs. And I spend so much time educating people on what socialism actually means, only to have it undermined by this new left who seem to agree with the paranoid lunatics on the far right that socialism is identical to Marxism, or only taking the Marxist definition of socialism, which is not helpful. The language appears to have left me behind. The politics appears to have left me behind. I'm arguing for left-wing politics on the basis of its history and its philosophy. It's anti-hierarchical, that it's for equality and fairness, equality before the law, equal opportunity, not enforced equal outcome. That most successful societies on Earth are socialist, and the ones that are most successful tend to be the most socialist, where you define success in terms of happiness, lack of criminality, fairness, equality before the law, gender equality, all of those kind of things. It tends to be the more socialist countries, particularly the Scandinavian countries, who combine that with very powerful local democracy, that seem the way to go, the model for the rest of us that we, for some reason, steadfastly refuse to go along with. I mean, you can drill down even to particular policies, like Norway's prison system, or Finland's way of tackling homelessness, or Finland's education. And if you look at who does any of these things the best out of the world, it tends to be the Scandinavian countries that are at the top. And they're all extremely left-wing. They are socialist, regardless what their prime ministers say or what right-wing fanatics say. And yet, the new left is dangerously identitarian, antithetical to centuries of left-wing and small L libertarian thought. And both the left and right extremes seem to agree on a monstrous caricature of left-wing politics. So what can you do? All I can do is try to exemplify and educate about what it actually is, even the bits that I don't agree with. I struggle to understand conservatives. I struggle to understand the right wing. But if you look at the excesses of the new left, the pseudo-left, the identitarian left, whatever you want to call it, then it becomes more obviously a reaction to that. And in that context, I can understand it. So if... I still hesitate to call them left-wing because they're not really left-wing, but if one group is centering the importance of blackness, it becomes black nationalists and characterize themselves as the left, then it seems obvious to me that you're going to get a reaction that centers whiteness as an identity, as a reaction to that. And in reality, I would say that both of these groups have what is characteristically right-wing views, where they centre identitarianism, whether it be nationalism, race, gender, whether it be patriarchy or gynocentric society, or whatever it might be. You know, they're just reflections of each other, and they're certainly not left-wing, and these points of view are more commonly associated with right-wing authoritarianism. and left-wing or right-wing are essentially meaningless labels, whether you're arguing that melanated people are superior or non-melanated people are superior. It's the same fascism in a different mask. So I struggle. I also struggle to understand more moderate conservatives who style themselves as pragmatists or fiscal conservatives, and yet make blatantly ideological decisions and support blatantly ideological policies that go against those very claims themselves. So, for example, if you're a fiscal conservative, you should be all in for socialised healthcare, because it's a hell of a lot cheaper and provides a much more effective service for the money. So if you're a fiscal conservative, you should be all in for that because it saves money and provides a better service. You get more bang for your buck. Or they make unpragmatic decisions, support unpragmatic policies, like, again, Brexit, which is going to cost an enormous amount of money, sink the UK economy into a deep, deep hole at a time where there's already a larger crisis. So why do it if you claim to be a pragmatic conservative when there are no pragmatic reasons for it whatsoever? The hypocrisy is something. I have a problem with hypocrisy. Whichever wing of politics people are on, I have a big problem with hypocrisy. And I shouldn't, because in order to be a hypocrite, you have to be trying to do the right thing but fail to do it. And we all fail, and you can be forgiving and understanding of people that fail, but it does seem to happen more on the conservative side. And as much as I try to understand and be tolerant and to wrap my head around why people make these decisions that they do, it's difficult. And I think this rise of the right reflects the failures on the left more than anything else. You wouldn't have had a Trump without the failures of Obama, for example. Again, I don't know what you do about it. Because if you don't follow through on your promises, then the pendulum just swings rapidly the other way. And that's dangerous. The way I try to live my life, the principles that I uphold, seem to confuse a lot of people for some reason, and it's a little bit hard for me to understand why these things confuse them, and I have repeatedly set them out in detail, and yet it still seems to confuse people. The one that seems to confuse people the most is that I call myself an anarchist, but I support things like socialism, like using the state in particular ways. I think I've explained this a bit earlier when I said that I don't do faith, I do belief, and I would call myself a radical pragmatist in a lot of ways, in that reality and pragmatism overrides any other beliefs or ideologies or whatever else I might have. I don't regard an ideology as an absolute set of rules or grab bag of concepts that I absolutely have to adhere to. Rather, I would say that my anarchism is the pointer on a compass. This is the direction that I want to move in, and anything that moves even slightly in that direction is worth doing, and anything that moves away too far from that is probably not worth doing. So when I call myself an anarchist, what I'm advocating for is the greatest possible amount of freedom for the greatest possible number of people. So if we look at a particular policy, does that increase overall personal liberty, or does it decrease overall personal liberty? So we can look at, again, something like healthcare. Is greater freedom for the greater number of people forwarded by a private healthcare system with middlemen and gouging and people being left without any healthcare because their pocketbook isn't heavy enough? Probably not. Is more freedom for more people enacted when we club together as a society and we pay for healthcare for everybody, and that nobody is driven bankrupt and everybody can access the healthcare they need in a reasonable order to a reasonable quality? Probably yes. So, apply that to any particular policy you care to name, and that's my guiding light. So my anarchism doesn't mean that I am against the state in the particular, when it comes to a particular policy or whatever else. My anarchism is what gives people the greatest amount of freedom overall. And this is just guidelines more than your actual rules, but it's the compass pointer. So that's how I make my decisions about what I advocate for, what I believe, what I support is, does this create a greater amount of freedom for the greater number of people? There's other factors, like the right to life is probably the primary right above all others, because you can't exercise any other rights if you're dead, for example. What justifies imposing laws or restrictions on people? I would say harm, by which I mean physical harm. I'm a libertine, which basically means so long as what you're doing doesn't hurt anybody else or unacceptably increase risk to anyone else, then fill your boots, knock yourself out, I don't care, let your freak flag fly. It shouldn't matter. So I am incredibly accepting of people in sex work, for example. I think personal drug use of just about any drug should be allowed, but we should do what we can to allow people to access medical care to help deal with addiction and to ensure that the supply is clean and safe, and so on. Similarly with sex work, I think we should do what we can to ensure that that's safe, both for the punter and the provider, and so on. So this is small L libertarianism. Capital L libertarianism has become utterly retarded, but small L libertarianism fits in with my anarchism in that it's all about what provides the greatest freedom for the greatest number and what justifies constricting that freedom in any way. And we should always consider that incredibly difficult, in a detailed way. And that brings me on to my sort of last couple of points about personal philosophy. I try to live in it as authentic a way as possible. I try to tell people what I think in an unalloyed fashion, and sometimes this pushes people away, sometimes it draws people to me. You just have to kind of hope that they appreciate honesty. And as I said at the beginning, I always consider everything that I believe or think very, very carefully. And I think that's something we all should do, in that we should consciously consider what we believe, what we do, the choices that we make, rather than coming to an emotional decision and then post hoc rationalizing it using our conscious mind. It's difficult, and it can make you seem distant, and it can make you seem Spock-like, soulless, archly rational. And I can't help but see that as a positive and be acutely conscious of when I fail to do that. But it does make people react in a rather negative way. I'm against censorship, and I don't just mean governmental censorship, I mean private censorship, I mean fiscal censorship. I mean mobs demanding something be censored or someone be cancelled. All of this is profoundly negative and is extremely hard to justify, because words cannot in and of themselves cause harm. There are blurred lines, like the publication of the Anarchist Cookbook or stochastic terrorism, where your words can cause other people to do harm on your behalf, but by and large, censorship is a terrible idea. It creates a victim mentality and a sense of self-justification in the people that you're censoring. In this world that we live in now, on these platforms that we're talking on now, this is now the public square, but it's in private hands, and allowing them to censor it just because it goes along with your particular ideals of the moment is profoundly toxic and is going to bite you on the arse in the end. And it has indeed bitten people on the arse who were saying that it was a good idea. So some people were happy to have certain political and social views censored off the platform, though this was done for commercial interests, only to find out that those same commercial interests were unhappy with things that they talked about or believed in, such as LGBT issues, which made certain advertisers nervous and led to a crackdown on advertising and so on those. Well, you helped create the atmosphere that led to your censorship by censoring other people. And there are other invasive toxic effects upon society that stem from censorship. If you no longer argue your point, if you just try to stifle the other person's point, you lose the experience of arguing for the things that you believe in. And so they get stronger. Whatever side is open about their beliefs and willing to debate and discuss them gets traction, while those that seek to silence and censor others look like assholes and bolster people's curiosity about the other. It's not that you insulted me so I became a fascist. It's you insulted me, these people were nice to me, you blocked me, censored me, cut me off, these people engaged me, talked to me, welcomed me, and so you end up surrounded by one set of points of view, and so your own views, unless you're extremely strong-willed and strong-minded, will tend to shift slowly and slowly in that way. And their arguments get unmet by the other side, who no longer know even how to argue against them. Censorship is profoundly toxic and is one of the big issues of the age. And while there are horrendous views being expressed by certain people that are being censored, there are horrendous views being expressed by other people that aren't being censored. There is no real difference between a white nationalist and a black nationalist. One will be censored, one won't. And the constant accusations towards people who aren't racists, who aren't white nationalists, but get called that all the time, it calls into question the labelling of other people with that. I don't think there is a pipeline on YouTube and so on that leads people further to the right. There is a problem with algorithmic reinforcement, but in my experience it tends to be that the audience drags the provider of entertainment in their direction more than the other way around. If you look at someone like Sargon, for example. But censorship, it's almost always a terrible idea, and the solution to bad speech is, generally speaking, more speech. And people are utterly confused about what does and doesn't constitute censorship, and use that confusion to excuse censorship of their enemies. And that happens on both sides. Gender issues are a difficult quagmire. I've never really considered myself to be a men's rights activist, though I've been called that, but I do have an acute interest in men's issues, primarily because of admittedly personal subjective experiences through life, and as a consequence, my considered opinion that at this point, I think at least in terms of legality and politics, men are more discriminated against than women. Just to pluck an example out of the air, even though this video isn't really about me justifying my beliefs, women have protection from having their genitals mutilated, and there are different degrees of female genital mutilation, one of which is roughly equivalent to circumcision. They're all banned, punishable in various societies, while the genital mutilation of little boys still proceeds completely legally. This isn't to say that there aren't certain social issues and so on, that there isn't still a place for feminism, certainly in many other non-Western societies, but I think the pendulum has perhaps shifted too far the other way at this point, in terms of law and politics at least. Socially, I think there are also issues, but there perhaps women still have more of an axe to grind. But this is an extremely difficult thing to talk about, It seems like every year the only men's issue we talk about on International Men's Day is male mental health and suicide, which is good. I mean, I have those problems, which in particular is one of the reasons that I got into discussing men's issues and so on. But there's more. There is a lot more. Education, poverty, work, so many things. And instead we just fix upon this one thing, perhaps because it's so inarguable, though every year someone tries to argue the toss the other way anyway. And I've been, while I don't consider myself a men's rights activist, I have been men's rights adjacent for a long time. There are people who are men's rights advocates and so on, who I have considered friends and acquaintances in the past, but over the last few years there's definitely been a slide to the right. Why? Because I think their audience has slid to the right, and it's hard to get money for these causes, so you kind of have to go where the money is. But the thing is, shifting to the right on a civil rights issue doesn't make any sense, because civil rights are naturally at home in the left wing. You're arguing for equality and fairness and equal rights. These are fundamental properties of left-wing politics as a whole, socialism in particular. So moving to the right doesn't make any sense, especially because many of the more extreme elements on the right are arguing that a patriarchy, not the patriarchy, is the way to go. That men are superior or should be considered superior. Well, that's not what we want, is it? We want equality, we want fairness. So I find myself pushed more and more out of that space by the toxic attitudes that I see expressed there, which I think in the long term are going to be counterproductive towards getting any of these issues looked at or addressed. Because they're certainly not being addressed by feminism or the new left, and they're not going to be addressed by the right. And all you do is end up creating a backlash against what are issues that should be at home on the left. So I find myself increasingly distancing myself from that group and their politics, which is unfortunate because you need collective action to make change. Race issues have come to the fore in a way that I don't think particularly makes sense. We've made an enormous amount of progress, perhaps too slow for some people, but certainly we have made an enormous amount of progress, legally and politically, and the social side obviously takes longer, but we were getting there. And then suddenly, somehow, the emphasis became not about ignoring race, treating it as irrelevant, but we had to centre race in absolutely everything that we did. We had to judge people and elevate people based on their race rather than their capability. Everything had to be diverse, and so everything became homogenous. It's particularly frustrating here in the UK because our history of race relations and our country's relationship with slavery is not the same as that in the United States. But American culture is so predominant that we seem to import all their stupid issues. To me, the vast and overwhelming majority of these issues that we class as race issues are actually class issues, even in the States. Because for so long, the underclass, the lower class, the Venn diagram almost entirely overlapped with black people. And that's no longer the case so much, that we still have a hangover, obviously, but it's a lack of social mobility that is the real problem in the States. It's a lack of investment. It's a lack of opportunity to climb the ladder in the States, this despite it being a country that prides itself on being a place where anybody can succeed. But the simple fact of the matter is that it's not true. It's one of the least socially and economically mobile countries in the first world. And the UK is not especially far behind. But we're still not America, and our relationship with race is different. And in neither country is anyone alive today who benefited directly from slavery. White people as a whole did not benefit from slavery. the 1% of the time benefited from slavery. And we don't hold responsibility for what our ancestors have done. I hold responsibility for what I have done, not what my great-great-great-grandpa may have done in this period. Original sin isn't a thing. I reject it in religion. I'm not going to accept it in any secular fashion. It's absurd. It's ridiculous. And centering race issues in the way that people have has just made it worse and has driven people to the right, because you see the most gratuitous and obscene racism coming from black nationalists and others, Chinese nationalists as well, and it's just given a pass in a way that the obscene racism of the far right, of the obnoxious white people, that gets pressed upon. I mean, this is a living example of unfair, biased racial treatment. Either all of these racist viewpoints are horrendous and terrible and shouldn't be allowed to spread, should go challenged, or not. It shouldn't be one rule for one and one rule for the other. If you're a black supremacist, you should be subjected to the same social censure and reaction as white supremacists. But that's just not the way it goes. But it's class issues. It's not race at all once you drill down, or barely race at all once you drill down. It's class. It's prejudice and attitudes about the poor and the working class and the underclass, more than it is about race. It's more obvious outside the US, but I think it holds true in America as well. When it comes to LGBTQ plus, or is it quilt bag now? When it comes to those issues, alphabet issues, should be obvious from earlier. I don't care. Do what you want, as long as it doesn't hurt anybody. So most of this is non-issue. Where I think we have some issues that we need to work through, and we're not able to work through, are when it comes to the Q, which has become a meaningless sort of virtue signal. To describe yourself as queer means nothing other than maybe you have a shaved undercut. At this point, where it used to mean something, it used to have semantic value. And when it comes to the T, there are issues. My formative experiences with trans people were pretty negative, and nobody's perfect. I let that colour my perception more than I should have, for which I've apologised. Not that anyone who needed to hear it probably heard it. And I put a great deal of effort into understanding trans issues. I followed a huge amount of trans activists on social media, tried to ask them questions, tried to understand their points of view. Did not go well, probably because most activists are assholes. Now, I tend to think, as a bit of an activist myself, and a varying degree of arsehole, your mileage may vary, that my job as an activist, when I am being an activist, entails explaining things to people and having discussions with people who differ from my point of view, in an attempt to persuade them to at least live and let live, if nothing else. These activists seem to see it as their job to be as vile and bigoted as they accused other people of being, and to spend all of their time harassing and haranguing people rather than trying to persuade them. They certainly did not see any part of their job as being explaining anything to anyone or helping anyone with their questions, which is unfortunate, because great swathes of the cause are just, and I believe as long as you're not hurting anybody, you should be left alone. More recently, I've been trying to understand the TERF point of view, which is kind of difficult, as they also have their own issues with bigotry and so on. But by and large, I found them to be much nicer people on an interpersonal basis, and much more willing to talk and discuss and to debate their point of view in a way that the opposite didn't. And I believe I've waxed lyrical on why that's a problem earlier in this video already. By and large, people should be just left alone to live their life as they want, right? I have no issue with trans people. I've employed them, I've worked with them, I've helped fund transition surgeries for some of them. Nothing personal against them. Wouldn't want to sleep with one, but that's just down to a matter of personal taste. And if you do, all good. knock yourself out, fill your boots, and vice versa. Where we start running into problems, and this is where TERFs come in, I think, is a lot of radical feminists really hate men. And because they regard trans women as men, it's not that they're necessarily hateful towards trans people, it's that they're hateful towards men, and they are so hateful towards men that they even hate men who have become women. That's a problem. However, there are also people being labelled as TERFs whose concerns are different and perhaps more understandable. People who've had bad experiences with men, rape, sexual assault, violent partners and so on, are understandably, I think, however irrationally, uneasy around men or people who appear to be men in any way, around male genitals. That's kind of understandable, and that is the kernel, the nub at the centre of concerns about trans people using the same bathrooms as biological women, and so on, and accessing prisons and accessing safe houses from abusive and violent partners and so on. Phobias are by their nature irrational, and while not all men, hashtag not all men, are violent or rapists or whatever, you can understand why someone who has been the recipient of violent treatment might be a bit antsy around people who don't pass or who still have male genitals. And there are people, however small a number, who do exploit these loopholes we've created in order to be abusive. It's a tiny minority of a tiny minority, but to deny that it exists isn't accurate. Better to try and say how rare it is, I think, to acknowledge its existence and to try and safeguard against it, but to acknowledge that it's also incredibly rare. And then there's things like sports and so on, where going through a male puberty does have long-lasting physical effects. Reach, muscle mass, bone density. I mean, someone who's been through the hormone treatments and everything else isn't going to be as divergent, but they are still going to be more divergent on average and have many advantages. I don't know how we negotiate around this, how we deal with all this, whether we start classifying sports not on gender but on androgens, or what. But we need to be able to have this discussion, and we're not able to have this discussion because people aren't looking to come to any sort of accommodation. They're waiting for someone to use slightly incorrect language or to say something that they can fight them over, and that's not conducive to coming to any sort of mutual understanding at all. I think it's possible, but not right now. But we need to be able to have the discussion, even in clumsy terms, before we can make any progress. And that holds true for most things. Thanks for bearing with me while I get all of this off my chest. I'm going to finish out with something that'll probably seem petty to a lot of people, but is deeply personal. I've devoted my life to the creative arts, particularly role-playing games, but I also write and do various other things, and I am sick of being gaslit and of seeing other people being gaslit over their concerns about censorship and the negative impact that woke scolds are having on an enormous number of hobbies, pastimes, sexual practices, particularly in kink, and so on. Almost every hobby has always been pretty open up until quite recently. People are enthusiastic about the things that they love, and they want other people to be as enthusiastic and engaged and involved as they are in these things. And so there was never any mileage in being prejudiced and exclusionary and gatekeeping to any extreme degree. A lot of what people took as being gatekeeping was people just trying to ascertain what you were into, what you liked, that sort of thing. You know, who are your favourite Thundercats? It's not a gatekeeping question, it's a getting to know you question. And people can be overwhelmingly enthusiastic about the things that they love. So a lot of stuff has been taken as negative that isn't. A lot of stuff has been taken as gatekeeping that isn't. There's a sort of revisionist history of things like gaming and so on going around, that it's always been a white men's club because white men were horrible in the hobby, were horrible to other people, or a lack of representation. Nothing could be further from the truth. Historically, there are always assholes in every hobby, but that's not indicative of the culture of the hobby as a whole. And yet you try to bring any of this stuff up. You try to point out the negative impact that the homogenization of gaming and art and creativity has had, or how anti-harassment policies aren't actually anti-harassment policies if you look at what they're saying, or whatever it might be. Anytime you try and bring it up, nobody listens. They just call you a bigot. Nobody acknowledges the negative impact that these things are having on, name whatever hobby or fandom you like. And it's because, ironically, people have been so open and accepting and welcoming that these things have gotten traction and started to cause damage in all of these things. And that has then in turn made people defensive and more gatekeepy. And even then, you tend to find that the people being more defensive, protective, and gatekeepy are doing so because they want whatever hobby or fandom it is that they're part of to continue to be good, to continue to be open. And it's the people who are preaching equality and diversity and so on that are actually the ones being exclusionary and much more overtly gatekeeping. I'm sick of being gaslit about it, and I'm sick of being lumped in with right-wing bigots, many of whom have sort of grifted and latched themselves onto these issues. But that doesn't mean the issues aren't genuine. If Stalin told you that 2 + 2 is 4, he's right, even though he's Stalin, and even though he might put it in a horrible way. Comrade, 2 + 2 is 4, right? Or, if you disagree, you will be sent to the Siberian camps. Well, it is 4. Regardless. I want, in everything, everyone to be as free as possible. I don't think the homogenization of creativity, I don't think the erasure of history or the redefining of history is useful or helpful. I think eliminating hardship and villainy and things from creative enterprises, from stories, from history is counterproductive. But nobody will listen to that. Nobody will listen to the issues that you're actually presenting. And even if they will, it's usually just to try and dismiss your concerns in a way that they wouldn't tolerate for their own concerns. And they don't have arguments in the way that I and a lot of other people do have to support their point of view. They just accuse you of something, and I'm utterly, utterly sick of it. I want the greatest amount of freedom for the greatest number of people everywhere, especially in creative enterprises. I don't know why that is so hard to grasp and to understand, how or why people filter that and transmute it into meaning something different, but it's incredibly frustrating and makes you feel trapped. Thank you for sitting through nearly an hour of me waffling on about nothing. Hopefully you do find my voice soothing. The point here was not to make persuasive arguments for any of this stuff, but just to sort of set out my stall. If you think I've missed anything, you want me to cover anything, to expand on anything, or to justify my position on anything, let me know in the comments. Zang. Rob Necronomicon's art has graced several Postmortem Studios products, and Rob has also produced some stock art pieces you can use in your own projects or at your gaming table. Rob's stark, dark graphical style is perfect for horror, old school fantasy, and dark future projects. You can buy Rob's art from Postmortem Studios at DrivethruRPG or at post-mort.com.
I don't like the, I have, okay, like a lot of you, I hate a lot, you know? But I hate with style and creativity.